Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. There's only one thing happening in the world of IT at the moment, and that is the Crowdstrike outage, or the outages caused by Crowdstrike. So I really can't avoid talking about that, but today what I'm actually going to focus on is the risks of a monoculture in the networking world. Big word, monoculture. What is that? Monoculture is just a fancy way of having one word to say everybody's using the same thing. That's what it is. Just one set of software that everybody's using. What that is could be different. In this case, for Crowdstrike, we're talking about security software, a specific type of security software. But we could just as easily be talking about the same email provider, the same operating system, the same internet service provider. It's just a fancy way of saying everybody's using the same thing. There are risks associated with that. As we can clearly see, if it happens to go down, it all goes down. But more specifically, what are some of the instances that we have seen both now and in the past? What are the downsides? What are some of the benefits? And what kinds of what kinds of things should you think about, rather, to enhance your own decision making and figure out where your balance point is between the benefits and the drawbacks? Okay. So the world of computers, the internet, technology in general, has always been fairly full of people who have a product to sell, shall we say. Sometimes they're competing for the same niche. Sometimes they're in completely different fields, but the main thing has always been there's never been a single way of doing things. In networking, you have Ethernet, you have FDDI, you have token ring, you have a bunch of different protocols. In routing protocols, you might have RIP, you might have IGRP, you might have OSPF, you might have BGP. There's a lot of different protocols. In the world of operating systems, Windows, Mac, FreeBSD, OpenBSD, NetBSD, Linux, and that can be broken down Debian, Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu, all the distros. And then you also have some other interesting outliers all on their own. Slackware, SunOS, Solaris, OpenVMS. It's like we could go all the way back to the DEC Alpha if we wanted to in Alpha OS, OS 2. I could just keep reeling them off. There's always been a bunch of different options. Browsers, Internet Explorer, Netscape Navigator, Netscape Communicator, Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, Brave, Opera. There's a whole bunch of options. And so a lot of the focus in technology has been on interoperability, making sure that everything can work together and play nice in the same field of operation. I'm mixing my metaphors like crazy, don't mind me. However, corporate entities, businesses, often like to centralize on a single standard platform. And the suppliers of those platforms will often try to push their own products. Microsoft, back in the 90s, had their hands slapped pretty hard for this because they went, oh, hey, a browser. Why don't we just put a browser in our operating system and then nobody has to download a competitor's product anymore? They can just use what's there. And because it's default, a lot of people did. That's how we wound up with Internet Explorer, which was a terrible thing for web standards because Internet Explorer very much started out as, okay, we'll play nice with other people. Oh, but then we'll introduce our own little extensions. We'll introduce our own things that only we can do for you. And then it's like, and now we won't let anybody else do the same thing. This is an exclusive feature. And because Internet Explorer was so heavily used, this meant that everybody developed for it, and it wasn't parsable. It wasn't able to be rendered correctly by standards compliant browsers. Now, after a good bit of history, we're now in a place where most of the time we're in a standards compliant world until you talk about Google Chrome. And now we're in the other flip side of that, where Internet Explorer is gone, and what's replaced it, Microsoft Edge, is actually based on Chromium, the open source version of Google Chrome. So as far as rendering standards go, it doesn't matter whether it's Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge, it's the same thing. Again, you can just use what's built in, and you're basically using Google Chrome, except it's called Microsoft Edge, and it wants you to use a Microsoft account instead of a Google account. But it's the same code. Google has therefore moved to a lot of in-house extensions, shall we say, which they then try to push on the rest of the internet as a new standard. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes not so much. It can lead to some cool advances. And then there's some things which people go, actually, we don't like the way that this works, because it really only works for Google Chrome. And Google Chrome can say, that's too bad. I'm, some arbitrary percentage of the market, 80%, let's say. Suck it up, buttercup. That's not good for standards and interoperability. And it leads to more of this monoculture, where everybody's using the same thing. On the one hand, that can be good. If everybody's using the same thing, then that essentially becomes a standard, maybe not the standard, but a standard. And you can have one set of how-tos, you can have one set of knowledge, of one set of settings, and you just work with what you've got. But that's not how networks were ever conceived of. That's never been what networking has been about. And on the drawback side, it can lead to reduced creativity because you only have one set of options and that's what you're limited to. In effect, even if it's not a hard lock, you only have one source of your software. What happens if that source breaks? What happens if it's compromised? Speaking about my own customers, none of our customers were using Crowdstrike. So in terms of personal impact to me, I've gotten away relatively scot-free this time. But we can see from the sheer number of things affected how impactful something like this can be. Whether it's mobile ordering at your local Starbucks, or whether it's airports. In my personal region, a lot of the hospitals have had to switch to paper because the health authorities mostly used Crowdstrike, and so the health authorities' computers have all been rendered incapacitated for the time being. And so there was this huge push to get people back onto actually tracking things on paper, which has always been there. I wish to be clear. Our clients in the healthcare industry all have paper backups because if the internet goes down or there's a computer outage or something else, you need to be able to continue delivering healthcare. That's not an option. So paper backups do exist for a very good reason. They had to switch to those paper backups. such a broad swath of things has been affected by one piece of software. You can say, well, if it was a bigger company, a Microsoft perhaps, this wouldn't happen. You sure about that? I'll talk about a different area of software, email. So for some years now, the big push has been moving people to cloud-based email in the corporate world. Used to be a lot of businesses had an in-house email server. In the Microsoft world, that would be Microsoft Exchange. And so Exchange management used to be a fairly needed topic, shall we say? I was going to say a fairly complex topic, but it didn't used to be complex. It still is complex. But you had that in-house. For a lot of smaller businesses, it never made a lot of sense. Exchange is not only a complicated thing to maintain, set up, administer, it's also a little bit on the pricey side. And so a small business, it just doesn't make fiscal sense to do that. For those clients, it made all the sense in the world to move to Office 365 or Google Workspace or some other cloud email provider. It made sense. It still does. But when you're talking about larger businesses, 400 users, 600 users, you're moving more and more to cloud. The benefits, well, you don't have to run the hardware yourself in-house. You don't need to have an IT staff or hire outside IT staff with that knowledge to maintain it. You can just outsource that and say, Microsoft will take care of it. Okay, fine. What happens if Microsoft goes down? And you can sit there and say, that will never happen. Or you can also take a more nihilistic perspective, which I have had people try and tell me this, incidentally, which is, well, but if Microsoft goes down, then everybody will be down and so it won't matter. That didn't satisfy me then. It doesn't satisfy me now. I always prefer, personally, to take the approach of, I want to know that what I'm running will continue to run because I'm the person in charge of it. If I make a mistake, my stuff goes down, but it won't affect anybody else. The counter argument to that is, okay, well, who do you think is going to make more mistakes on average? You or Microsoft? I am arrogant enough to say my answer is usually, I think Microsoft is going to make more mistakes than I am. Perhaps not on average. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the benefit of having people running their own thing is, if there's a big issue, it can't knock everybody out. Am I saying that everybody should run their own email server? No, I'm not. Like I said, for small businesses, it doesn't make sense. You don't have the money to purchase it, to hire the people to maintain it. It doesn't make sense at all. So cloud email is perfectly fine. Am I saying that everybody should be using a different browser and nobody should standardize on anything? No, I'm not even saying that. I think it might be helpful if every browser was forced to support actual standards and then everybody coded with actual standards, it wouldn't make a difference. No matter what browser you were using, it would render the same way. But I also understand that because things will put settings in different places and you need to be able to standardize your educational practices to tell your staff, go here, click this, do that. I also understand that you kind of want to be using the same thing, or at least the same set of 2 or 3 options. I get that, I really do. Where I think it becomes a problem is when so many people are using the same thing. It means that there's very little room for error. And if something happens, a mistake is made, and let's face it, mistakes are made, it's going to take down a lot of stuff. Where has this happened before? Well, back in 2014, we had a major vulnerability in OpenSSL, which was called Heartbleed. OpenSSL was and remains a major part of a lot of critical internet infrastructure. It's often included in routers. It's often used to secure web servers. It's used extensively across the Linux world, and therefore in a lot of embedded devices as well. So to have a vulnerability of that magnitude in those products was a huge, huge problem. OpenSSL is also an open source project. It's run by a bunch of volunteers. Things are going to happen. Something gets missed. You try not to have that happen because these people are really good at what they do. But everybody's human. Everybody makes mistakes. Were we affected by that? No, we weren't. We were using Windows. The Windows crypto stack, crypto API, was not affected by Heartbleed because it was a different implementation of the same standards. So we could tell our customers, yes, your payroll software is safe because we're not using that one particular product. In this case, none of our customers are affected by the Crowdstrike issue. We're not using that product. We're using something different. I've looked at Crowdstrike. I've tried using Crowdstrike before. Didn't meet my standards. So it's not something we ever went with. We do have software that does the same thing. It's just different. What are some of the things that you can look at? Look at how willing a vendor is to offer you details. That's something that I always have valued highly, is whether a vendor is actually willing to give me details. I've had a customer in the last week or two ask me, hi, we need to know X, Y, Z, A, B, C. What sort of encryption methods do you use? It's not in my nature to give people a blow-off answer like, oh, we use state-of-the-art encryption. What is that? What is that? I go, okay, we're using these specific 6 ciphers. There's a 7th one currently enabled for a migration issue, but I expect to have that one disabled again. We're using all Galois counter mode ciphers. We're not using any cipher block chaining mode ciphers. Details. I want details. I'm going to give details. We went to our security software provider, one of our security software providers, and we said, hey, can we ask you for information on how you prevent issues like this update issue that Crowdstrike is experiencing so we can communicate that to our customers? They went into detail. They went into detail about, we make sure that we test all of our software changes on our computers internally first before it goes out to anybody. We make sure we only roll it out to a certain percentage of customers at a time so that it doesn't go everywhere. Say if there's a large change being made, we make sure that each update is only one change so that you can actually test that one change and be confident in it. You don't have to worry about overlooking anything. You're just looking at the one thing. They went into detail on their update practices, the various rings that they use. this is all good stuff. And it says a good thing when a vendor is willing to explain how they're doing this, what kinds of things what kinds of precautions they're taking to make sure that they are not going to cause an issue. Or if an issue does slip through, that they can catch it quickly and before it goes to all of their customers. Because that ended up being the issue here with Crowdstrike. They pushed an update, an hour and a half later, they had a fixed version out there. But in that hour and a half, look at all of the stuff that was affected. This was not, it went out to 10% of the customers, some of them had an issue, and so we held back. That's not what happened. That's absolutely not what happened here. It's a little disconcerting to me to see all the talking heads, all the commentators going, this is probably going to take weeks to clean up. They're right. I know that they're right. I looked into what the issue was. Yes, it would take a long, long time to deal with this effectively. And if our customers had been using this, it would be taking us weeks to recover from it as well, to recover all of them from it. I'm glad it's not us. My heart goes out to everybody who is having to deal with it. These are just some of the risks of a monoculture of software. And while standardization has benefits, sometimes the risks can be pretty bad. And this is incidentally the same kind of risk analysis that we make with backups all the time. You may never need a backup for 10 years. But if you suddenly have a fire and the building burns down, you'd better hope that you've got good backups. Because if you don't, you could very well be out of business. It's an insurance policy, essentially. You hope you never need it, but when you need it, you really need it. Anyway, that's some of my thoughts on the Crowdstrike issue. And I hope to everybody who was affected, I hope the resolution comes quickly for you, and I hope that you are able to resume normal operations as quickly as possible. For everybody helping with that cleanup, more power to you. I'm afraid you're going to need it. Well, but for now, that's what I've got for you this week. And hopefully we'll have something a little less prompted by current events next time. But for now, I am your next door net admin, and we'll see you next time.